Sisimulan na po natin ang ating tapatan sa Aristocrat this morning. We're happy to have with us our guests. Nagkaroon ng konting problema yung ilang panauhin. I have a message here from former Senator Leti Ramos-Shahani. So sorry Melo, an emergency happened last night in our building in Urdaneta City and I need to come to Urdaneta where I am right now. So she cannot come. Tapos si Attorney Harry Roque can't make it, flying off to Bangkok. But we have our guests today, so let's begin. Maganda po itong paksang pag-uusapan. May kinalaman po ito sa Philippines-China relations, especially after the Philippines filed its memorial with the International Arbitral Tribunal. So, ano ang kompleksyon ng relasyon ng Pilipinas at ng China? Ang aking pong panauhin ay si Ginoong Chito Sta Romana. Siya po ay Bureau Chief ng ABC sa Beijing. Dati. Retirado na. Subalit, batid ang nagaganap sa China ngayon. Kasama rin po natin ang isang profesor mula sa Ateneo. Isa po namang laging hinahabol din ng mga taga-media tulad ng Al Jazeera, ng China Central Television, at iba pa. Siya po ay nagsusulat din sa Huffington Post. So, si Professor Richard Heydarian. Simulan natin mga kaibigan. Let me pose the first questions to our guests with Chito and Richard. How important is the memorial that the Philippines submitted to the International Arbitral Tribunal? Chito.
First of all, a disclaimer. I no longer work for ABC News, and I am now an independent China analyst. I've retired from ABC News, but I worked for ABC News for more than 20 years in Beijing, China. And I will actually be helping in a private capacity ABC News when they do the TV pool coverage of the Obama visit next week. But having said that, so I speak for myself. I don't work for ABC, I don't work for the Philippine government, and I don't work for any government, certainly not the Chinese government. Regarding the memorial, this is a landmark case in terms of international maritime law and in terms of the UN law of the sea. This is the first time that the Philippines has filed the case under the UN law of the sea. And this is also the first time that China has been sued under the UN law of the sea. So it's certainly a major case involving the Philippines and China and involving the UN law of the sea. The hope of the Philippines is that it will clarify our maritime entitlements, meaning that it will settle once and for all what we are entitled to, and we are seeking the 200-mile exclusive economic zone. Now, in theory, it should be a simple case. It should be a slam dunk because it is provided under the UN law of the sea that you are entitled to 200 miles. The Philippine side seeks to have the 9-dash line of China declared invalid and illegal, and to have the Chinese occupied reefs and shoals declared as simply rocks only or low level elevations, in other words, submerged reefs that are not capable of claiming more than just 12 miles territorial sea and certainly not 200 miles. Having said that, I now want to tell you that the Chinese are not taking it sitting down. Being a legal case, the Chinese are engaged in what they call a legal warfare. And by this I mean they do not accept the arbitration process. They have declared this, and they will not participate, nor will they abide by the decision. But this does not mean that the Chinese are not making their legal case to their own people and to the international community. One, you've seen the position paper issued by the Chinese embassy here, explaining the legal basis of why they are not participating and giving the legal basis of their case. Second, for those of you who are interested to research this case further, a prominent Chinese lawyer, an international law expert of China, has published a scholarly legal article in the American Journal of International Law January last year, in which it states the legal basis, the historical and legal basis of China's 9-dash line. It makes the case that China's 9-dash line is not just a figment of the Chinese imagination, but based on their historical and legal claim. It's actually written by two Chinese scholars. One is Professor Zhiguo Gao, and the other one is Bingbing Jia. Zhiguo Gao is an interesting scholar. He is a sitting judge of the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea. Unlike the Philippines, we don't have a judge in ITLOS. The Chinese have a judge sitting in ITLOS. And this fellow is not only an international legal scholar, he also holds the title of the executive director of the China Maritime Affairs Institute, which is under the Chinese government's State Oceanic Administration, which is in charge of the Chinese Coast Guard. And this same scholar was reported last July by the official Chinese news agency as having participated in a Politburo study session on China's maritime strategy. So he is also an advisor to the Chinese Politburo. The significance of the article, for those of you who want to go into it, is that it makes an important point. From the point of view of the Philippine case, we base our whole argument that the 9-dash line is illegal. Why? Because the Chinese claim not only the islands or the maritime features, the insular features within the 9-dash line, but the Philippine case states that China claims all the waters within the 9-dash line as its territorial waters. And therefore, we say that this is not in accordance with UNCLOS. Professor Gao makes the case that China's position is that it is simply a marker, that it is a dash line and not a continuous line, and therefore they are claiming the islands, but not the waters as their territorial claim. This is important because it makes a distinction between territorial claim and maritime claim. If it's a territorial claim, it is not covered by UNCLOS. If it's a maritime claim, then it is covered by UNCLOS. But the more important thing is that he makes the case that the territorial claim is in accordance with international law, with general international law, and that because they claim the islands, they are entitled under UNCLOS to their own maritime entitlements. In other words, and this is reiterated in a Chinese government letter to the UN in April, in 2011, it makes the case, it states there, that the Chinese claim the islands in the South China Sea, all the islands that are visible at high tide. And second, it states explicitly that the Spratlys, Nansha, is entitled not only to 12 miles, but also to 200 miles EEZ and continental shelf. This is actually a critical point because this is what the Philippine side does not accept, and this is the crux of the argument. The Philippine position is that we are entitled to 200 miles and that none of the islands in the South China Sea are entitled to 200 miles. The Chinese takes the opposite position. That they own the Spratlys, aside from the Paracels and the Pratas and the Macclesfield Bank, but that the Spratlys are entitled to 200 miles. So they make the case for an overlapping EEZ. And if you have an overlapping EEZ, if the tribunal accepts this argument, then you have to divide the waters between the Spratlys and Palawan. So this is where the argument is. The Chinese are not counting the 200 miles from Hainan or from the mainland. They are counting from the Spratlys. And there is one inconvenient truth that we have to face. That the biggest island in the Spratlys is occupied not by the Philippines. It is not Pag-asa Island. Neither is it occupied by Vietnam. It is not the island called Spratly. It is rather an island called Itu Aba, or Taiping Island. This is the biggest island there, which is occupied not by the mainland Chinese, but by Taiwan. But under the One China principle, if it's occupied by Taiwan, therefore it is occupied. It is under the One China principle, then it's also claimed by China. And if it's the biggest island, the question is it entitled to 200 miles? By the way, it's the only island supposedly in the Spratlys that has fresh water supply. So this is an inconvenient truth, but it is a thing we have to face. If the tribunal were to accept this, then the question would be how to divide the waters. And our 200 miles would not be a simple counting of 200 miles from Palawan. And this is actually one of the issues that we hope can be clarified by the tribunal. The basic Chinese argument, to summarize it, is this. From the Philippine point of view, we want to claim 200 miles from our baselines. The Chinese take the position, but we claim and that we own the Spratlys. And we also count 200 miles from the Spratlys. So how do we settle this? If you follow the rules of UNCLOS, and if you accept that argument, it will be a median line, an equidistant line. That is why we don't accept that argument, and we hope the tribunal can clarify it. So, to summarize this point again, the Chinese make the point, can you really determine maritime entitlement without first determining who owns the Spratlys? We claim part of the Spratlys. The Chinese claim all of the Spratlys, and the Vietnamese claim also all of the Spratlys. Unless you resolve who owns either all of the Spratlys or whichever part of the Spratlys is owned by whom, then how can you count your entitlement? Can you solve the issue of entitlement without solving the issue of territorial sovereignty? And if you involve sovereignty, then it is not covered by UNCLOS. That is why the Chinese argument is the one of jurisdiction. If it involves the issue of sovereignty, then how can the tribunal accept the case? This is something we have to watch for. And certainly, if it involves maritime or boundary delimitation, then this is one of the exemptions that the Chinese declared when they opted out in a declaration of 2006. The whole point I'm making is that it is more complicated than what it seems to be on the surface. And we have to be prepared, the Philippine side, that it will not be a slam dunk, that we will have to fight our case. And we have to win our case so that it will clarify these legal issues and it will strengthen and bolster our case as we try to determine what really is legitimately ours. And the last point I'm making is that the Chinese, they found their own legal advisor, an international legal advisor. They have a German lawyer, international lawyer, Professor Stefan Talmon of the University of Bonn and Oxford University. He came out last January or last February with a book, together with, again, Professor Bingbing Jia of Tsinghua University, in which, if you look at this 280-plus page book, it is virtually a rejoinder, a point-by-point reply to the Philippine position. By the way, the Philippine position, the 4,000-page position, is not yet in the public domain. It has not yet been put on the website of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So I haven't read it. I don't know if there's any change in the Philippine legal argument. What is in the public domain is the notification and the claim. So certainly, we would like to know more about how the Philippines is going to argue this case. We now know the Chinese argument, although they're not part of the case and they will not participate, but because they have engaged in this public legal warfare, it is out there in terms of what is in the public domain. On that note, I think I'd like to end my introductory comments.
And that's just the introduction, my friends. Professor Heydarian, how do you look at all these things?
My points of view here don't reflect Ateneo's point of view, nor
Okay.
Asia Times and Huffington Post and other places I write for. But, okay, on one hand, we should not be very surprised with the filing of the memorial at ITLOS, because this maneuver has been in the offing since late 2012. I think after our mid-2012 Scarborough clash with China, we have been dangling this option of filing the case at ITLOS. But I think what is surprising with us moving forward with the memorial case is that we did it despite the fact that China in recent months has been vigorously lobbying us to postpone it, not to drop the case, but to postpone it, which says that the Chinese are extremely sensitive to this issue. So in my opinion, more than a legal issue, this has strategic and diplomatic implications. First of all, this is the first time that any country in this region has openly and formally questioned China's 9-line doctrine. And the 9-line doctrine pertains to what China believes it has inherent and indisputable sovereignty over. So we have explicitly, in some sense, tried to slap the Chinese in the face. In that sense, I think this was a very big move. Second, we have broken with the tradition in the region. If you look at the tradition of how countries in Southeast Asia, with respect to China, have been dealing with their territorial disputes, it tends to be always on a bilateral level. People try to always emphasize joint development and shelving sovereignty issues. And after the 2010 declaration on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea, we have been trying to deal with them in combination of bilateral negotiations and also multilateral negotiations under the aegis of ASEAN. But now that the Philippines has moved forward with this memorial case, I think we have completely broken with the tradition. I think more than that, my fear is that this could lead to a complete collapse in diplomatic communication channels between the Philippines and China, because apparently reports suggest that the Chinese were willing to first consider mutual disengagement, not only from Second Thomas Shoal, but also from Scarborough Shoal. Second, to postpone almost permanently the imposition of an ADIZ in the South China Sea. And thirdly, to consider economic and investment incentives for the Philippines. So China provided us a number of concrete incentives for us to at least postpone it, because they knew that it would be too embarrassing for the Aquino administration to just openly and absolutely drop. And I think that could really cause a permanent estrangement in bilateral ties between Philippines and China. But on the other hand, I think we should not be surprised that the Philippines has chosen to move forward with this case, because it marks the convergence of legal position between the Philippines on one hand, the United States on the other, and neighbors such as Indonesia. On one hand, if you look at in February, the United States State Department has made it very clear, and also the same thing with the Ambassador of the United States, that the 9-line doctrine has no basis in international law, especially using the provisions of the UNCLOS. So you have a clear convergence between the Philippines and the United States there. If you look at the United States position previously, including statements by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in ARF in Hanoi in 2010, the United States always tried to have a semi-neutral position by saying that freedom of navigation is in the national interest of the United States. But the United States does not take a direct position on the sovereignty who has the sovereignty over disputed features. But in February, the United States, I think, more or less has moved closer to supporting directly the Philippine position by saying the 9-line doctrine of U.S. has no basis. But I think the more important development in Southeast Asia is that Republic of Indonesia, shortly after the Philippines filed the memorial, also came out and criticized whether the 9-line doctrine has a basis in international law. So you don't only have a convergence of position between the Philippines and U.S. as two longtime allies, but also a convergence of position between the Philippines and Indonesia. And that's very important because Indonesia for years has tried to position itself as a neutral party, which is not directly involved in the South China Sea disputes, but can play a diplomatic role because of its informal leadership status in ASEAN. But now even Indonesia is saying that we are concerned with the legality of the 9-line doctrine, and the 9-line doctrine has implications even for Indonesia's islands such as the oil-rich Natuna Islands. I think that's a very important thing. But to put it very shortly, I don't want to exhaust, this is just going to be a teaser. My point is that I have certain reservations with us filing the memorial. If you look at it since 2012, something good about the memorial is that in 2012, the ICJ made a ruling on the Nicaragua versus Colombia case, which made it very clear that the prevailing jurisprudence in international law today is that contested features, especially which are not clearly islands, it's very questionable for whoever controls that to have another 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone. So that indirectly questions if China can implement the same thing that Chito has been talking about. So I think Philippines has been very encouraged by new decisions on the level of international law. But on the other hand, the problem with our case is that, first of all, if you look at the 9-line doctrine of China, it's very vague, it's very ambivalent. You don't have clear coordinates there. China has astutely made sure that it will be vague so that in an event of an adjudication, it will be very difficult for any swift resolution of that. And more than that, China is basing this entire 9-line doctrine on quite unprecedented historical claims going all the way back to Ming Dynasty. The implication is that I think it will be quite difficult for the ICJ to come up with a swift, clear-cut decision in a short manner of time. I think that's the kind of ambivalence that I share as far as this legal move is concerned. Thank you.
Please identify yourself and the entity you come from. But having seen nobody interested in asking question, anong implikasyon ng, sandali lang, anong implikasyon ng pagdalaw ni Pangulong Barack Obama sa katayuan ng Pilipinas ngayon tungkol sa China? So what is the impact of President Obama's visit to the Philippines?
You want to take this first?
Yeah. Okay.
I think what the countries in Asia will be looking for, particularly the Philippines, will be, and what we can expect is a form of reassurance from the U.S. And the thing to watch out for is how President Obama will express this, in what form. U.S. policy has shifted very markedly this year. And this is evident in the statements of Donny Russell, the Assistant Secretary of State for Asia and the Pacific. In the testimony to the U.S. Congress, I believe it was February, the U.S. came out very strongly on the principle, which was very critical of the 9-line. When Donny Russell said that that any territorial claim must be based on land, not on history and not on maritime claims. This is a very important principle that the U.S. has actually stated now as a matter of policy. It has been stated at the ASEC level. It has been stated at the National Security Advisor level. Now we will see if the Secretary of State and the President of the United States will also state it at their level. Because this will be a clear slap at China and on the 9-line claim. But the advantage of this, it forces, it will pressure China. And this is one of the benefits, by the way, of this landmark case that the Philippines has filed. It is forcing China to clarify exactly what the 9-dash line means. From the point of view of the Philippines, as I said earlier, we view it as China's territorial border. The Chinese have not stated the same thing. What they have stated in their note verbal to the UN in 2009 and 2011 is they try to keep it vague. They don't even mention or explain the 9-dash line. They simply say, attached is a map, and the map has the 9-dash line. It does not mention the 9-dash line. As a matter of fact, it is very difficult to find in the Chinese official document an explanation of the 9-dash line. When I mentioned the case of this ITLOS, of the Chinese ITLOS judge, he is still speaking. Although he's a government official and an ITLOS judge, he is still speaking for himself. He is not speaking for the Chinese government. But it is one indication of a moderate wing in the Chinese government lobbying for a certain position. Whether the Chinese government will accept that and say so officially is something we have to watch for. But going back to President Obama, so this will be a very important matter because one, he has to provide substance, both in rhetoric and in actual conduct of the U.S. on the rebalancing, to show that it is not merely a rhetorical policy, that there is something substantial to it, and that the U.S. will stick to this rebalancing policy towards Asia in the face of the crisis in Crimea, in the face of the crisis in the Middle East, because if you look at the time spent of some of the Secretary of State, for example, it looks almost that the rebalancing went to the Middle East or to the Israeli-Palestine issue, or it went to Crimea. And because there are now different challenges to the U.S., both from Putin and from Russia and from China. So we will have a better indication, I think, during this visit of the status of U.S. foreign policy and its commitment to the Asia-Pacific region.
Yes, Professor.
Yeah, I mean, without exaggeration, I think this would be Obama's perhaps most important trip to Asia to this date, because it will be the first time that Obama will visit Malaysia in 50 years. And with all of the troubles that is happening right now in East Asia and the promise of the rebalancing towards Asia since 2011, it's really incumbent on the Obama administration to make sure that they are really committed to this part of the world, and they are going to make sure that, for instance, countries like China will not take advantage of the fact that the United States has been strategically a little bit pushed back in the case of Eastern Ukraine today. Crimea, I think, is a done deal. It's Eastern Ukraine. And now also in the case of Iranian nuclear program, and also in the case of Israel and Palestine. So I think it's extremely important there. But trying to connect to what I was saying a while ago, I'll be very quick about this. Now that we have risked almost the collapse of diplomatic channels with China, and I think we have a little bit pissed them off, it is extremely important for the Philippines to make sure that we have a way to deter the Chinese from any sorts of retaliation. Because the Chinese government has been sending feelers that this will not go down unpunished. So it's very important for the Philippines to make sure that by Obama's visit, we'll most likely coincide with the new security pact, which will be the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. And we'll make sure that under this new security agreement with the United States, there will be a value added. And the value added we should be looking for is that the United States will make sure that they will come to our rescue in an event of a conflict in the South China Sea, especially if it has to do with China trying to retaliate by expanding its patrols in the South China Sea area or tightening its siege on areas such as Ayungin, Second Thomas Shoal, for instance. So I think it's a very high stakes, it's extremely high stakes trip that we really should watch for.
You don't play with me because I have my big brother, right? Ganun ba yun?
I and Chito, I mean, that's what you would have loved to have Harry here. I and Chito share a lot of opinion, and one of them is that as far as China is concerned, you have to combine hedging and engagement. Now that the engagement track, in my opinion, is quite extinguished because of us going forward with the East laws, despite aggressive position of China. Our fallback option should be that we should make sure that we hedge against a Chinese retaliation. And strengthening of our military alliance with the United States and Japan and the rest would be extremely important in that regard. I mean, if you look at it, I'll put it very, very briefly. If you look at the rhetoric of China right now, I think the diplomatic gloves are off. For years, the Chinese diplomatic corps has been the one trying to come up with a moderate rhetoric. But now, if you look at the statements of the Chinese ambassador in U.S., Chinese Foreign Ministry, even them, they have dropped, the gloves are off as far as the diplomatic track is concerned. My fear is that the next step would be gloves are off on the military front. So we have to make sure to prevent a military confrontation, and the only way to do that is to strengthening our military alliance with the United States in a concrete way. I think it should be more than just allowing the United States to have greater access to Subic and Clark. It should go beyond that. It should be a way that it makes sure it sends a clear signal to the Chinese that the United States will be there for the Philippines if a clash or accidental confrontation happens in the South China Sea. So for me, it's extremely important.
My question is, since one of the judges in the IT laws is from the Chinese Politburo, what is the chance of our memorial claim?
He himself is a well-known international lawyer. And he is a member of the IT laws as a judge, but he is not part of the arbitral tribunal. Okay, let me make a distinction. The International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea is based in Hamburg, and they deliberate on cases presented to IT laws. But our particular case is an arbitration case. It is not being deliberated in Hamburg. Rather, they designated an ad hoc arbitral tribunal made up, and they appointed 5 judges from Ghana, from the Netherlands, France, Germany, etc. 5 of them. And what has been designated as the place for the arbitration is at The Hague, at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So for those of you who are following this case, you should look at the PCA website, Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. It's designated by the IT laws to handle this case. And as I said, there you will see the documents that have been made public, the notification and claim, but the 4,000-page document that we submitted has not yet been put on their website. But one thing I will tell you is that the Chinese will try their best to achieve their goal. And what is their goal? 1, to have this case dismissed. And second, if it is accepted, to have it decided in their favor, just as much as we want it in our favor. We had a workshop, an academic workshop at the UP, jointly done by the UP Asian Center and the National Defense College more than a week ago, in which we did scenarios. What are the possible scenarios resulting from this arbitration process? And basically, the discussion outlined 4 possible scenarios. One is a total victory for the Philippines. In other words, all the claims we want, all the awards we want are rewarded to us. Second, a mix. That's we win some, but we don't get everything. We lose some. Third is that the Chinese, of course, win the case. We don't achieve anything. And fourth, which is a variation of the third, is that the tribunal dismisses everything and says that we don't have jurisdiction because it involves territorial sovereignty or it is beyond the scope of the tribunal, because the tribunal can only decide on matters regarding interpretation or application of UNCLOS. So that's why I was saying earlier that the Chinese are making the point that UNCLOS is not the applicable international law to this case. So But having outlined the four possible scenarios, I think the best thing is we're prepared for the best, we hope for the best, but we prepare for the worst. We try our best to win this case, but even if we win, it's the start of another process. You have to convince the Chinese to abide by it. And the Chinese, on the other hand, are hoping that it is dismissed or that we lose so that we are forced to a negotiation. It seems to me you have to negotiate with the Chinese. You win the case, you lose the case, you still have to negotiate with them to abide by the decision if you win.
Oh, one last. On Obama's visit, does the maritime dispute in the West Philippine Sea and in Japan escalating because of the Chinese intrusions? It's escalating kasi does the Obama visit justify the escalation of the what they call this? Yung
Chinese activities.
Chinese activities in the China's.
I think you have to put it in broad strategic terms, no? What the Chinese are after and what will keep them from, let's say, a military invasion of the Philippines. I'm often asked this, are the Chinese about to invade us? No? And I tell them, the Chinese, what they want is, you see, the basic premise of the Chinese mindset is this, that they own the islands in the South China Sea and that they want to recover.
Yes.
The term for it in political science is irredentismo, irredentism. It comes from the Italian word irredentismo. No? They want to recover what they consider to be historical lands that they lost, or islands. Whether it is really theirs is, of course, a matter of dispute, but the point I'm making is that is their goal. What is keeping them from achieving that goal? The dominant naval and military power in the Asia-Pacific region right now is still the U.S. And this is not my personal opinion. If you consult the London-based Institute of Strategic Studies, they tell you that the balance of power is in favor of the U.S., and the Chinese cannot challenge the U.S. dominance in the Asia-Pacific region for at least a decade or even more. What is happening and what has happened over the past 30 years is the rise of Chinese economic power. From a third world country, China has now become the second largest economy. And part of their economic power, they have diverted to military power, so they are starting to challenge. But not yet, they have not yet reached a position of parity with the Americans. It will take them 10, 20 or more years. And it depends on the economic growth. And they are facing economic problems right now. So what the Chinese want to avoid is they want to avoid a war with the Americans. If they were facing the Americans, they will not. You see, the Chinese are students of the balance of power. They're trying to recover from what they call the century of humiliation, wherein they lost to foreign powers. If they engage in a war and they lose again, do they want another century of humiliation? No, they don't. So what they're trying to do is build up their power. But it will take them, they have to strengthen their economy some more. They are now, although they're the second largest economy in the world, they are really a middle income economy. The average income in China is roughly around $8,000 to $9,000. In the US, it's $50,000. In Japan, it's just somewhere below that. And even Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan have much higher per capita income than mainland China. They want to advance from a middle income economy to a higher income economy by 2049, the centennial of the founding of the People's Republic of China. But even then, the goal is only like a European average, OECD average. So it will take them perhaps till the end of the century to even approximate the Japanese, the Singaporean, or the American per capita. So the point I'm saying is that look at the Chinese economy, look at the balance of power, particularly military power in Asia, and then you will see what the Chinese are doing. They're dealing with us because they're stronger than us, and that's why we call them a bully. We perceive them to be a bully because they deal with a weaker power. But if you are backed up by a bigger power, and then the bigger power is willing to face up to the Chinese, that will deter them. There's only one thing though. The Chinese are waging what I would consider a calibrated low-intensity struggle. What some people consider as salami slicing tactics. They don't want to take over Ayungin right now or to take over Pag-asa. They could do it if they wanted to, but because it will cause a bigger confrontation that could bring American forces and test the Mutual Defense Treaty. So they do it within certain parameters. They don't want to create a war that will deflect them from their economic development, but they will not, but they are waiting for us to commit tactical mistakes. They will use it as a pretext to recover what they consider as their lost islands or their lost territory. And what are these tactical mistakes we have to be careful of? The mistake we committed when we shot the Taiwanese fishermen. The mistake we committed when we tried to arrest Chinese fishermen and not estimating that there will be a Chinese pushback. In other words, expect a Chinese pushback if you try to arrest a fisherman or if you shoot at the Chinese Coast Guard or a Chinese Navy or Chinese boat in the disputed waters. The presence of American forces in the Philippines will not stop the Chinese asserting their claim, but they will stop short of causing, or they will be deterred from an outright military confrontation. It does not eliminate the possibility of a short, sharp military confrontation or skirmish in case of miscalculation. But from my point of view, if we pay attention, if the Philippine forces pay attention to tactics, we could hold on to what we have. It is for us to lose if we make a mistake, but the margin of error is quite small.
Okay.
Yeah.
Professor.
Let me add, I think one important thing people are forgetting is that while the tensions between the Philippines and China is very hot, actually things are quite different between China and Japan and Vietnam in recent months. In fact, there was a very interesting study on Washington Post by two political scientists from MIT and Harvard, and it showed that quantitatively since October, Chinese paramilitary and Coast Guard patrols in the Senkaku-Diaoyu area actually has decreased dramatically. So if you look at it, what actually China did is that it used to push its Coast Guard all the way to the 12 nautical miles territorial zone of Senkaku-Diaoyu, forcing the Japanese to make a mistake. You know, that's what actually they've been doing. But now, not only has that decreased, most of the patrols are happening in the 12 to 24 nautical miles contiguous zone. Now, here in the Southeast Asia, actually, if you look at it, Vietnam and China also, their tensions have not been that high. You see some diplomatic criticism from Vietnam against China here and there, but you don't see any kind of major clash or confrontation between the Vietnamese and the Chinese. So it's very clear that the rising tensions in the first chain of islands in the Western Pacific have been predominantly between the Philippines and China. And you can make a connection that it might have something to do with the dribble game, the volleyball we have been playing over filing of the ITLOS case. So I think this is a very important distinction because Chito was talking about that the moderates in China are also trying to speak out. So it shows that actually the moderates in China have been convincing the top leadership to dial down the tensions towards Japan. I think the explanation is basically because of the military prowess of Japan, and towards Vietnam. Why? Because of Vietnam's subtle diplomacy wherein it doesn't openly criticize China. And actually they have behind the doors backdoor diplomatic channels. And the Vietnamese and Chinese have been actually trying to negotiate their own bilateral agreement to dial down their tensions. So I think let's be very careful. The tensions right now in the Western Pacific, it's predominantly between the Philippines and China.
Because the Vietnamese are friends to the Americans, they're friends to the Chinese, and they get what they want.
Um, Actually, it's almost a paradox what happened here. There was a time the Vietnamese were in the front line against China. And how we ended up in the front line, and the Vietnamese are no longer in the front line, actually shows the skill, I think, of the Vietnamese. They have adopted what I think is a very skillful strategy. Not only Vietnam, as well as other claimant states in Southeast Asia, are now having a free ride on the Philippines. We have taken the mantle of standing up, of challenging Goliath, so to speak. And because of this, and the Chinese, of course, will make us pay a price. But we hope that we'll be able to at least achieve legal clarity, or as we put it, to stand up for the rule of law in doing so. The Vietnamese have adopted a combination strategy. Bilateral with respect to the paracels. They are conducting bilateral negotiations with the Chinese, and then multilateral with respect to the Spratlys. They're studying the legal option, but they're watching first and see how far we can go and if we will succeed. So, in a sense, I think the Vietnamese have been very skillful, and basically we have now taken the status of the frontline state insofar as challenging China is concerned. The question, of course, ultimately for us is, where does our national interest really lie? And we hope we're following the correct path. I think we have to see this through, whether we succeed or we fail. But we have to realize that even if we win the legal case, the road is not yet, we have not yet achieved our ultimate goal. The test of our policy will be whether we can maintain what we hold on right now. Because if at the end we lose what we have, then ultimately there is a problem in our tactic, there's a problem in our policy. For example, in the case of Scarborough, we wanted to assert our sovereignty. That's why we wanted to arrest the fishermen. But looking back, what did we achieve? We lost effective control. Maybe we should have used different tactics instead. But it's a lesson. It's part of a learning curve for the Philippines. We're actually learning about international politics. That international politics is not only about international law, it is a combination of power and law. And it is not an easy business. It is not only right versus might. Right must be backed up by might, and might must have right behind it for it to be effective. So the point is, I think in going through this experience, we also get to know more about the nature of international politics.
Oh, well, they're quiet on the diplomatic front, which is the opposite of the Philippines. They're also opposite of the Philippines when it comes to their military capabilities. I mean, since the 1990s, we have been talking about modernization of Philippine military. But up to now, there's a tremendous gap in terms of even developing a minimum deterrence capability. So the Vietnamese, while they have been being quite quiet and astute on the diplomatic level, if you look at their military relations, it's very diversified. They have military relationship with the Russians, with the Indians, with the Japanese, with the Americans. And that diversified military relationship allows Vietnam to slowly build up its military capabilities. So soon Vietnam will also be in a position to actually a little bit ward off the Chinese and give them a second thought before using the military. While in the case of the Philippines, we have been talking very tough in terms of our diplomacy, in terms of our rhetoric, but unfortunately, if you look at the military front, we have not yet developed even a minimum deterrence capability. While the Chinese, every year, they have been increasing their military spending by 10 to 12%. So what was a minimum deterrence capability for the Philippines in 2011 will not be applicable today because of the tremendous trajectory of improvement in Chinese military capability. So I think that's one thing we have to learn from the Vietnamese. a little bit more astute and reserved on the diplomatic front, but diversified military relations and a very successful modernization of program of their military, especially on the naval front and also on the Coast Guard front.
Foreign Affairs Secretary Albert de Rosario said that he has exhausted all diplomatic, political, and other means dealing with the Chinese. And the last one left was the legal, which is to sue the Chinese before the ITLOS. My question is that, is the President receiving the proper foreign policy advice? And is there is still time to recover if we consider this is the filing a mistake? Is there still time to correct that mistake? Well, he is the embodiment of our foreign policy.
Precisely.
That's why kung ano man yung ginagawa ni Albert de Rosario is also a reflection of the thinking in Malacanang.
Okay. Gentlemen? Is the President getting the right advice?
It's not easy to answer this question. but I think they have tried to reach out to a variety of views. Now, whether they have exhausted all the views and all the advice possible, we have already filed our memorial. To backtrack now is even worse. We have to see this through, whether to victory or defeat. And this is also part of our culture. We like to file cases. We file cases not only against our former president, our relatives, our spouses, when we have differences. It is part of almost a tradition of litigation. We want to achieve legal clarity. And the Chinese left us very little choice. What is the reason why we resorted to this? It has something to do with the outcome of the Panatag Shoal, the Scarborough Shoal. We cannot engage in a maritime standoff. We cannot engage in a naval standoff. So the best weapon we had was the legal. The only problem is it's also a complicated struggle. However, under the rules of procedures, if you check the rules of procedures, and if you look at the experience of ITLOS, our case is, I think, case number 9 or number 10. There have only been 8 cases, arbitration cases, since ITLOS, or since UNCLOS
1982.
was 94 when it was ratified, and then they set up the ITLOS, and then you have ITLOS, and then you have Arbitration Tribunal. So it's not common. This is a rare case, the first time against China. Under the rules, there are 2 things worth noting. While the case is being filed, there have been cases among the 8 cases that have been that the Arbitration Tribunal have dealt with in the past, when both parties or the parties involved have been able to settle ahead of a decision. In other words, there have been settlements outside the court settlement is possible. So that is one option, that you could have a multilateral through the tribunal, and you could also have bilateral outside. In other words, the discussions, whether back channel, front channel, whatever, can still continue, but there is a degree of statesmanship is needed on both sides. Both sides will have to agree to have talks while this thing is going on. That's one possibility. The other one, if you look at the rules of the rules of procedure, the expenses for the tribunal, including the salaries and the travel expenses of the judges, have to be borne by both sides. But if you only have one side that is participating and the other says it will not participate, I guess we have to shoulder all the expenses. And so we are basically footing the bill for the arbitration tribunal, because I don't think the Chinese will contribute. So you enter into this gray area that if you win and you foot the bill, you can see how the Chinese will answer this, will reply. But the point I'm making, however, is that look at the rules of procedures for those of you who are following the case. So you know the next thing they have to do is they have to acknowledge receipt. And the tribunal will have to meet. And then they have to give the Chinese sufficient time if they want to file a counter memorial. And I don't expect them to file, but they will certainly issue some sort of statement as what they've been doing. They're conducting their legal warfare from outside the court. And that is what will happen. So the point I'm making is that there are options open to the government. And I know there is a very intense struggle within the cabinet on only multilateral, or do we open the door to bilateral, or do we combine, like the Vietnamese? The decision, I think, so far is only multilateral.
Sorry, are you referring sa cabinet ng China o sa atin?
Apparently, there was some discussion in
Okay.
January, and then a decision was made in, July 2012, that we would only take the multilateral path.
Isang point na lang, Mr. Santa Romana, no? No country has ever accepted that the 9-dash line is acceptable, no? Because there are no coordinates. It is drawn on water. Paano mo naman may establish ang coordinates if it is drawn on water, no? And I think we have a strong argument on that. The trouble is that the Chinese have said expressly that the area within the 9-dash line is of core interest to them, meaning that they will go to war. Is that right?
No. This is where there is ambiguity on the Chinese position. Even the issue of core interest. There's been a debate on this, not only among Chinese scholars, not only among China watchers. What the Chinese define as their core interest, at the top of it, is state sovereignty and territorial integrity. And they define, what do they define as their state sovereignty? The islands. Taiwan, Senkaku, so land. And then the 12 miles, and then the 200 miles if they're entitled to it. They have not said that everything within the 9-dash line is their core interest. Nor have they said that the South China Sea is their core interest. What they've said is that the islands and reefs.
So may kaunting liwanag tayo ron sa claim natin to reject the 9-dash line.
No, we actually, you see, the problem is this, if you ask me. Our position is, the Philippine position is, if you look at the wording of the notification, that the Chinese claim everything in the 9-dash line, that it's their territorial boundary. The Chinese have not, if the Chinese now officially say that that is not the definition of the 9-dash line, our case may suffer. And they have, if they make that clarification, because they haven't made that clarification, the only thing they've said is they're claiming the islands plus adjacent waters. They have not defined adjacent, but usually adjacent would mean 12 miles. And then they say the seabed and continental shelf relevant waters. Relevant, if you define it only as 200 miles, that is within UNCLOS. The problem is, between the 200 miles and the 9-dash line, there is a gap. And they use a different argument, not officially yet, but they use the argument of the historic rights. And this is what we hope the tribunal can clarify. The Philippine position is that historic rights have been extinguished by UNCLOS. The Chinese position is the other way around. That even if there is UNCLOS, historic rights are maintained.
Memorial at the ITLOS, at the end of the day, even if we win the case, there is no internationally established enforcement mechanism to force the Chinese to abide by international ruling. So negotiation is an unavoidable fact of life. And for us in the Philippines to say that we no longer can negotiate with the Chinese, I think it's quite questionable. The other thing is that, if you look at it, Xi Jinping, the president of China, he has met all Asian leaders as far as East Asia is concerned, except the Philippines. It is only Aquino who he has not met yet. So I think it is quite premature to say that we cannot negotiate with the Chinese when we have not yet tried the track, tried to be as creative as possible to establish high-level negotiations between the Philippines and the Chinese. Yes, it is true that at the first months of Xi Jinping's coming to power in 2003, China was a little bit aggressive. But eventually, if you look at it, there were a lot of efforts by the Philippines, including Aquino himself, to reach out to the Chinese during the Kai Expo. In fact, in October and November, Aquino went all the way contradicting Voltaire Gasmin and contradicting the Rosario by saying that the concrete blocks that they talk about in Scarborough Shoal, they're not Chinese. They go all the way back to the Cold War. And then suddenly in February, you have Aquino likening China to Nazi Germany. I think that undermined whatever effort Aquino was trying to put in order to open communication channels with the Chinese. In fact, if you look at the reports, in late January, there was a high-level cabinet meeting wherein the Philippines discussed whether we should consider the incentives of China. Because apparently China offered us a number of incentives for us to postpone the filing of memorial on March 30. I think the best option would be we would have not filed the memorial yet, but use it as a bargaining chip to force the Chinese back to the negotiating table. I think that was the option that we should have considered back in January. But at the end of the day, I think the Del Rosario faction, the more hardline faction, felt that the only way forward with the Chinese is to file the case and then step up our military alliance with the United States in order to make sure that we preserve whatever territorial gains we had. In my opinion, what was better perhaps was we agreed to the Chinese that for the meantime, we can postpone the filing, but use that as a bargaining chip to open up channels of communication between Xi Jinping and Aquino, which has not happened yet. At this point in time, now that we have filed the case, I think it's very difficult for us to talk about resuscitating diplomatic channels. I think that was a strategy. We had the chance in January, but I think the hardliners won the day. And then when Aquino just basically likened the Chinese to Nazi Germany, I think that made things very difficult. To tell you how sensitive the Chinese were about that issue, when Xi Jinping went to Germany, he tried very hard to visit the Holocaust Memorial, because he wanted to show that unlike Japan, first of all, China has no skeleton in its historical closet, and second, China was with the Allies against Nazi Germany. So it shows the Chinese are extremely sensitive about this issue. And when you talk about a person like Xi Jinping, who is positioning himself as a very popular leader, not a technocratic leader like Hu Jintao, perhaps like the next Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong, it is very difficult for him to show compromise towards the Philippines when the Chinese people easily see that a country like Philippines, in their opinion, insults them in such an open manner. So I think these are subtle diplomatic opportunities that we kind of missed by moving forward with this kind of hardline position that we have.
Yes, Tracy.
Since we're going to foot the bill, this arbitration, and if in case there is a military conflict between the Philippines and China, is there a possibility, what would happen if there's a possibility that the Muslim separatists will take advantage of that?
Muslim separatists?
Yes, they would take advantage of that, certainly. If there's a conflict between Philippines and China, and we footing the bills, arbitration, about all these expenses, the Muslim separatists would certainly take advantage of that.
What if the Muslims take, advantage?
Can I clarify which Muslims are we talking about? Is it the MILF, MNLF? Is it the Abu Sayyaf? My short opinion would be, I think the momentum is definitely there for us to have a lasting deal in Mindanao. There's no guarantee for its success, but I think the upper echelons of the MNLF, the International Contact Group, all important powers, including Malaysia and the Aquino administration, are very much committed to a deal in Mindanao. And I think as far as our strategic planning is concerned, I think we kind of make a clear division about our war in the South China Sea and what happens in Mindanao. But will some extreme splinter groups take advantage? Of course. Think of Abu Sayyaf and all of those groups. Of course they'll take advantage whenever there's in fact, if there'll be a corruption scandal, they'll be taking advantage of that situation. But I think let's not overestimate how some splinter groups can push back the positive momentum that we have generated in Mindanao. I know it's very hard for us Filipinos to accept that at the end, perhaps we have a successful peace process in line, but I think we should be cautiously optimistic that what's happening in Mindanao is more or less irreversible.
Any follow-up? None? Okay. Yes, please.
My supposed question were partially answered by Professor Chito Santa Romana as to the aspect of what will happen in case there is a resolution from ITLOS that Philippines could claim, or their allegations or their claim will be resolved in favor of the government or of the Philippines. How would we execute the resolutions rendered by the ITLOS or the tribunal? Second question is, reaction lang gusto ko malaman. Now that the U.S. has dispatched U.S. Navy ships to Japan in order to assist Japan in a maritime
Dispute.
dispute regarding that small island which is called
Jayuay.
Jayuay. They have dispatched. Is there something to do with this dispatch as to the Obama's visit here in the Philippines?
Okay, okay.
What if we win the case? That is the most optimistic scenario, that we win totally. I actually think the arbitration tribunal, the 5 judges that compose it, these are very distinguished international lawyers. And they obviously have a stake in making sure that UNCLOS, is preserved, that ITLOS is able to be an effective dispute settlement mechanism. My personal view is that they will come up with some sort of a Solomonic decision. I don't know what that will be, but they'll try to prevent, I think, 2 bad outcomes. One is to prevent that UNCLOS becomes questioned, or in other words, that UNCLOS, the international law of the sea, is not effective on the one hand. On the other hand, the last thing I think they want also is for the Chinese to withdraw from UNCLOS as a result of a defeat. Now what they will do, though, is how they will reason it out, how they will judge this case, it's up to them. But assuming we win totally, then you basically have 2 possible alternatives. One is, and you can combine them. One is that you rely on the international community, you rely on the US, on Japan, and the international community to be able to enforce it. And here, it depends on what you want to be enforced. Because in my personal view, the US, on the one hand, wants good relations with China. On the other hand, I don't think the US, as the dominant power in Asia, will allow China to dominate or to control the strategic sea lanes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. But the international community has an interest in the peaceful resolution of the dispute, together with international public opinion. So this, I think, is the power we hope to rely on. Ultimately, though, you have to deal with China. And there is a question that is actually, it's like a debate in the inner soul of China that's going on right now. What kind of power do they want to be in the years to come? They want to be a responsible power. And this is the reason why I think by not joining, because they actually are waging a legal warfare outside the court. They actually missed an opportunity to defend their case within the arbitral tribunal and to prove their case within. And in doing so, to show that they're willing to abide by international law. No matter how sophisticated their argument is in showing why they have the right not to participate, they could still have chosen to do so. By not doing so, it creates doubts and suspicions that goes against their own long-term strategic interests on how they want to deal with their neighbors. Because if you look at Chinese foreign policy, it has been successful in Latin America, in Africa, in Europe, and even in North America. But it is the key problem in Chinese foreign policy is in dealing with their neighbor, particularly the maritime neighbors. And so there is a gap, and there is a big credibility gap between Chinese, what they say as their desire for a peaceful development, and their conduct in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea. And this is the reason why in the SWS survey of countries that Filipinos have trust on, the Chinese come out with the lowest and negative rating in the last quarter, last December. Even lower than Malaysia and then lower than Taiwan. But the point I'm making is that you basically rely on the international community. And it will be to our advantage given the current balance of power. But when the time comes that the Chinese are able to grow economically and are able to achieve parity with the US or even to surpass the US, then the situation could change. So this is going to be an issue for a long time to come. Because when you have both countries sticking to nationalism, and it is very strong on the Chinese side, and it is also very strong on the Philippine side. That is why more than 80 or 90% of Filipinos support the government policy. Because when you say that what is ours, and we fight for what is legitimately ours, and both sides are saying it, nationalism on both sides will, of course, support the government. But it lays the groundwork also for conflict. The point I'm saying is that what is needed is statesmanship on both sides and a great degree of that so that we can avoid a miscalculation or a military confrontation. The Chinese at this point certainly are not looking for a war that will divert them from their economic development. Neither is the US looking for a war with China. But I think what is at stake here are certain interests of both, and as we will see more of this, the strategic rivalry between the US and China. And unfortunately, we are caught in the middle. And you know the old African saying, when two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffer, and we are part of the grass. Well, the Chinese, if you read the Chinese media, you know, I mentioned that the Chinese is the least trusted country in the Philippines right now. A survey in China shows that the Philippines is the second least trusted country by the Chinese. Next to Japan. Japan is the least trusted. But we even beat the US. The US is more trusted than the Philippines. And then after the US, there's Vietnam and there's India. And if you look at all these countries, the common denominator as taking out the US is territorial and maritime dispute with the Chinese. Because the Chinese media, it portrays the Philippines as a troublemaker, as a provocateur, as a pawn, and as a Trojan horse of the US. So that is why the Chinese public do not trust us. So you have the case here for mutual hostility and mutual suspicion. And this shows the failure of public diplomacy on both sides. And the challenge for the Philippine media, for the Chinese media, to be able to explain to both publics, and the need also for objectivity on both sides. It is probably hard to ask that of the Chinese media, but what is interesting is a more recent survey that 60%
of the Chinese public actually favor that this issue be resolved through international adjudication. But at the same time, an equal number of Chinese public in 5 major cities where the survey was conducted also favor Chinese blockade of Philippine supply ships that carry supplies to islands and reefs that the Chinese claim are theirs. So you have this paradox in Chinese public opinion, mainly because these islands are being portrayed or are being claimed by China, and the media, the Chinese media, saying that these are ours and that this is illegally occupied by the Philippines. And at the same time, though, they don't want a war. And that's why you see a growing support for international adjudication. But it shows the complexity of the problem. And it shows also the development in China and in Chinese public opinion. It gives hope that if you win the case, clearly, that you could actually make the case to the international community, and you could actually make the case to the Chinese public. But it will not be so simple, of course. So if you ask what happens after, the Chinese hope that after we win our case, of course they're hoping we lose our case, you still go to the negotiating table with them and arrange a negotiated settlement bilaterally with the Chinese. The advantage, though, is that now you have a clearer legal advantage.
In one of the sessions we had with Ambassador Mak Ching some time ago, she noticed and she said, you know, Melo, then President Hu Jintao never talked about the South China Sea. But in the Philippines, almost everybody talks about the issue, including the President. And she was short of saying, only the barangay captain of Forbes Park has not said anything about it. No? So, will it be much better if our president would limit the arguments with his subalterns? Number one. Number two, in a lunch I had with some people from the Chinese embassy, they said, even if a decision would be in their favor, so what happens to us? Gentlemen.
It is true that in China, President Xi Jinping hardly says a word about the Philippines. I mean, they barely mention the Philippines. They mentioned, though, the South China Sea. Xi Jinping, in his visit to Germany or to Europe, mentioned something about, because he was asked about the South China Sea, and he came out with that statement that we are not seeking trouble in the South China Sea. And this is the problem with the Chinese position. And this is what creates a credibility gap between what they say and what they do. And this is because of the Chinese mindset. Premier Li Keqiang also made a similar statement in the Boao that we seek peace and development, but we will respond decisively to any provocation. Anything we do or anything that is done on the South China Sea involving the dispute, from the point of view of the Chinese, is a provocation. This is the problem in their statement. If the Chinese would only practice restraint, I think it would improve their popularity rating. But the problem with the Chinese foreign policy right now is that the basically Chinese foreign policy is almost contradictory because they have two pillars of Chinese foreign policy. On the one hand, they speak of peaceful development. On the other hand, they speak of defending their core interests, sovereignty and territorial integrity. The problem, there should be no problem with the first one. They want to develop their economy in a peaceful environment because if there is a war, then they cannot develop their economy. And if there is a war, then they have to fight. So they want to try to avoid the war. The problem is the other side, the defense of the core interests. This is a concept in Chinese foreign policy that came out about 10 years ago. But it is a consistent thread in Chinese foreign policy that where their national, or what they consider their national interest is threatened, they will respond decisively. The problem with this has to do with their evaluation on what is a core interest and what is worth fighting for or not. If an island that is not habited by any Chinese, there is no Chinatown there, it is populated mainly by fish, by corals. If they consider this and they come out with a slogan not to yield an inch to any foreign country, and that they're willing to fight and go to war over that, then it shows that it operates like blinders. And it contradicts the other side of their foreign policy of seeking a peaceful development. And this is the balance, I think, that the Chinese leaders find themselves trying almost like to walk a tightrope, because they are subject to domestic pressures. On the one hand, they want to develop their economy. On the other hand, you have had a citizenry that's had decades of a patriotic education campaign. This campaign started particularly after 1989, the Tiananmen uprising in Beijing, when the Communist Party was threatened and there was an uprising and the Communist Party split, and then they had to basically stand together and use tanks so that they could maintain themselves in power. And they thought that the best way to avoid that was to educate their youth about patriotism, about the century of humiliation. In doing that, though, you now have an aroused citizenry that has been fed this campaign line that we own all the islands in the South China Sea and the East China Sea and Taiwan, and that we should defend our sovereignty. And they're fed this line that the Philippines is illegally occupying. And not only the Philippines, Vietnam and Japan. So because of this, they have actually laid the seeds for conflict. And the problem for the leadership is to be able to control the situation so that despite the strong public pressure from within China, they are able to maintain their focus on the economic development and not go to war. I think now, though, you see the beginnings, I think, of an realization within China. And the example I will use, I think, has been cited by Richard here. The crisis with Japan was actually the key issue that the Chinese were paying attention to. The Philippine case was really a sideshow. We were the main issue in the time of the Scarborough Shoal, but after the Senkaku or Diaoyu Island crisis erupted, the Chinese paid attention more to the problem with Japan. But when the Japanese Prime Minister Abe went to visit Yasukuni, which is a very sensitive issue for the Chinese because it contains the remains of the World War II criminals, last December, I expected the Chinese to go berserk. I expected the Chinese to come out in demonstrations and to destroy Japanese cars and vehicles as they did 2 years ago. But what happened? The Chinese did not go out and demonstrate. They did not. What they did is that the Chinese ambassadors, 40 or 50 of them around the world, instead were instructed to conduct a letter-writing campaign. So here you can see the formation of a consensus, I think, within the top leadership and the military. And the consensus, the working consensus, I would say, is something like this. The military has agreed to support Xi Jinping and the top leadership. In exchange, Xi Jinping has agreed that you can push for our core interests, but one red line you cannot cross. Do not open fire first. Do not start a war with Japan such that the U.S. will be involved, such that the Chinese and the Americans will have a war, such that the Chinese economic development will be prejudiced, and the risk of a Chinese decade or a century of humiliation will be repeated. And so you see the Chinese, since October, reducing the patrols around the Senkakus. So the point I'm making is that what it shows is that if you pay attention to your tactics, the Chinese would actually focus on their economic development. But if you don't pay, if you start shooting at Chinese fishermen, if you start arresting them in the disputed, if you don't tone down the rhetoric, in other words, the challenge for us is to manage the dispute. We have to live with the reality that we have a dispute, a territorial and maritime dispute with China, and we have a case in the arbitral tribunal. But we have to manage that we have a dispute on the one hand and still try to build political relations on the other. In other words, having a case, filing a case on the one hand does not mean closing diplomatic channels, does not mean trying to avoid any contacts with the Chinese. Right now, of course, we're entering a very difficult period because this is certainly a landmark case. The Chinese have virtually frozen political relations. The Philippine president is not welcome in China, and for that matter, the top officials from the Philippines, and the invitation to the Chinese foreign minister to visit the Philippines, we won't see it for a while. But it does not mean there should be no diplomatic contacts. And the challenge is how to keep the channels open while proceeding with this case.
First of all, I think it's very important that we realize that the position of China is not a conspiracy of the upper echelons of the Politburo. It's a response to a strong popular impulse. No? There is some sort of democratic dimension to it. Just go to Weibo or major social networks in China and you see how the ordinary Chinese feel very strongly about this issue. I think the asymmetry in rhetoric has to do with the fact that while for us in the Philippines, what's happening in the West Philippine Sea is a question of territorial integrity, for the Chinese, I think it's still largely a question of prestige. The second thing that I think we have to realize is that beside the fact of popular nationalism, I think the second worrying trend in China is what I feel is this culture of self-righteousness. If you look at the Chinese right now, the motto of the Xi Jinping administration is very different from the motto of previous administrations like Hu Jintao, which focused on harmonious and peaceful rise of China. The motto of the Xi Jinping administration is China Dream, which is very similar to the notion of American Dream, right? If you talk to the Chinese, they keep on saying that, why are you criticizing us? It's very hypocritical for the Western powers, especially for US, to criticize us, because countries like the United States became global powers through first establishing a so-called Monroe Doctrine. US became a superpower because first it dominated its own adjacent waters and then it expanded globally. So for the Chinese, they're saying that yes, economically we're the second largest, soon will be the largest economy in the world, but unless we become the predominant power in our adjacent waters, we cannot claim to be a global superpower. So in that sense, they're saying that we are doing what exactly the Americans were doing in the 19th century. Of course, my counter is that, okay, you and Americans may have some historical baggages, but don't step on us, the third countries like the Philippines or, I don't know, Ukraine. I don't think we had any fault in that. But my problem is that there's this strong baggage of self-righteousness, which prevents the Chinese from seeing the position of weaker countries like the Philippines who are caught in this American-Chinese rivalry. The third issue that I think is very important for us to look at is this. It is true that the Chinese economy has been growing 6 to 8%, but now the economy is slowing down. And since 2013, China has been grappling with difficult scandals. Boshilai, right now, the former security chief of the Politburo, Mr. Zhou, he's under house arrest, he could go to jail. China is grappling with very difficult corruption scandals. It's grappling with very difficult economic issues now that the economy is growing. So my impression is that China's assertiveness on the international front is just a strategy of the leadership to make sure that it panders to domestic popular nationalism so that it has enough legitimacy and political capital to push through with very difficult economic revolution at home. If you look at China right now, they have to adjust their economy from an export-oriented economy into a domestic consumption-driven economy. And that will be very difficult. There will be a lot of people who will not be happy about what's going to happen in China. A lot of export-oriented businessmen and business lobby are very angry with Xi Jinping. They're not happy with the crackdown on the corruption scandal. So for me, my impression is that China has to play it a little bit tough on the international front so that it builds enough political capital at home to push through with economic revolution. And I feel that for Xi Jinping administration, their #1 priority is to get through the economic reforms that they have to get through in the next 5 to 10 years. But as Chito correctly pointed out, the red line is clear. Let's make sure that we don't have an open conflict outside. And if you look at the Chinese strategy, unlike the Americans or the other country, it's not driven by chess. In chess, it's all about decisive warfare, completely defeating your enemy. What the Chinese follow is a go strategy. It's about encirclement, slow and gradual movement of your strategic benefits. So I think these are a number of issues that we have to keep in mind when we look at China, and we have to understand that perhaps the assertiveness of China is a temporary blip that could be dealt with if we emphasize diplomatic subtlety. My fear is that the more we go aggressive on the diplomatic and rhetorical front, the more we fuel this popular nationalism that is happening in countries like China.
Okay, we have time for 3 questions. Do we have questions from FOCAP? Yes, Lingoy.
Earlier, Chito mentioned that the U.S. position is to get away from historical and maritime bases and use land as the basis. Is that right? Well, what is the size of the land? No, like you mentioned that in the Pag-asa area, the Chinese have or are occupying a bigger piece of land than we are occupying. Now, for example, does it have to be as big as Palawan or as big as Luzon? Or not only land, but in terms of population, in terms of economic activity, and how high? In other words, does it have to be above the level of the tide, 24 hours?
One is that it must be visible at high tide. In other words, if it sinks at high tide, then it's not. This is the distinction between an island, rock, and the low level elevation. Low level elevation is the lowest category if it's submerged almost all the time. Rock, if it is submerged only at high tide. Did I get that right? Yeah, and visible at low tide. And then the island should be not only a naturally formed piece of land that is visible and above water at high tide, but it must be habitable. And this is where the ambiguity comes. None of these islands had any human population. And the weakness of the Chinese claim, of course, is that they did not build a Chinatown. If there was a Chinatown in any of this, the debate is over. But what happened was the Chinese fishermen, as well as Filipino fishermen, Vietnamese fishermen, in other words, fishermen all over Southeast Asia used to go there to fish and probably would stay for a night or 2 or 3. Here is where it becomes a problem. And we're hoping that the arbitral tribunal will define, whether it's an island, a rock, or whatever, because then you can define the maritime entitlement. From the point of view of the Chinese, let me tell you what the Chinese have said. They came out with a survey in their China Maritime Affairs Institute yearbook of 2011 of the Spratlys. They considered 25 islands in the Spratlys as islands, not just rocks or low-level elevation. From the point of view of the Philippines, I think even in the case of Pag-asa, we consider this as regime of islands, entitled only to 12 miles, not to 200. It is the Chinese that take the position that their claim are entitled to 200 miles. So this is where the biggest difference of opinion comes in, and we're hoping to achieve legal clarity on this. It is not easy, and there will have to be I mean, the arbitrators may have to visit some of these places to see for themselves before they can make a ruling, assuming they accept the case. But that is, what you're asking is exactly the crux of the issue, and that is why there is a problem. That is why there is a dispute.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Professor.
actually, one important factor you have to take into consideration is that they were going to develop, they were going to expand the so-called Sanxia City. It's in the Paracel, the Woody Island area. And they're going to make that really a prefecture of China, and they elevated its administrative status. What I'm saying is this. What we see as naturally formed as just an atoll or just a stone and not an island, what the Chinese are trying to do is to artificially make them an island. So the problem right now is that while we can say that naturally, we can in the Philippines argue that naturally these are just atolls, they're not island, it's not inhabitable. The Chinese, through their technological prowess, are artificially transforming these atolls into islands, which will eventually even give them a say on the legal front. My other issue is that if you look at a recent arbitration as far as territorial dispute is concerned, most of the time the party that won was a party that was able to exhibit continuous and effective exercise of sovereignty. It is true that we have been claiming a lot of islands here and there, but if you look at the Philippines, we have very limited indicators of really showing that we have effective and continuous exercise of sovereignty. You look at the Scarborough Shoal, yes, it was under administration of Bao de Masinloc, but what was the concrete manifestation that we really controlled that? Even more, you go to the second Thomas Shoal. You see that we only have a marooned ship there and then some maritime detachment, but we don't really have clear manifestation that we are exercising continuous and effective sovereignty. What the Chinese are doing is that by expanding artificially their constructions and detachment there, at some point in time, they'll be even able to win a case, perhaps, in the ICJ or ITLOS by saying that we exercise effective and continuous sovereignty. And by the way, these atolls and stones are not just atolls and stones. They're islands which, based on the UNCLOS, their interpretation of Article 121 of UNCLOS, can generate further 200 nautical miles. So what I'm trying to say is that the Chinese do not have a purely military strategy. They have a bifurcated strategy that even in an event of a legal showdown, they want to make sure that 5 to 10 years down the road, they artificially transform these features so that they can even legally win the case. So this is a very important issue I think we have to
would you say that our ship is not enough to manifest our presence in a particular area?
Yeah, I think we are still lucky that we still have something there. No, if we didn't have that, it would be very, very difficult for us. But I think it gives.
Wouldn't that be an environmental issue?
If you talk to some Chinese, they'll say that, look at us, we developed the islands, we put, perhaps we can even put golf course there. Look at the Lying, which is controlled by the Malaysians. And then you Filipinos are like informal sector guys in the South China Sea. If you look at it, what do we have there? A rusted ship from the Cold War. So they say that...
Well, thanks to the Americans.
yeah. So they're saying that, you're replicating the same kind of urban planning crisis that you have back in Manila also there. So my point here is this. Yes, we lay claim to those features. By the way, the EEZ gives us a level of jurisdiction to hydrocarbon and marine resources down the water. It doesn't automatically give us control over the features above the water. Within 12 nautical miles, we have complete jurisdiction. Within 24 nautical miles contiguous zone, we have limited jurisdiction. Within 200 nautical miles EEZ, we only have a level of jurisdiction what goes under. So we cannot definitely say what goes above. In fact, the Americans have been filing a lot of cases against the Philippines by us imposing our claim. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the latest. So the point is that if we really want to lay claim to these features, we have to show we have effective and continuous exercise of sovereignty. And it's not good when you have a marooned, rusted ship as our only manifestation that we lay claim to those features. So I think it's time that we not only focus on modernizing our military, but also to make sure that the islands that we already control, we show that we really have effective and continuous exercise of sovereignty. Go to the Pag-asa Island. Marcos in the 1960s already knew what was going to happen 30 years down the road. So he developed an airstrip there because he knew you would need, dispatching of your Air Force and all to defend it. He had that strategic foresight. Once Marcos was gone, we completely abandoned his strategic foresight. And look at it right now. The Taiwanese are developing advanced airstrip. The Chinese are developing Sanxia City. The Vietnamese have the most number of features occupied. In the case of the Philippines, what do we have? We have to pay certain people to just stay in the Pag-asa Island, right? And then sometimes we even struggle to replenish those guys with supplies. So my point is that at the end of the day, it's good to file a case at ITLOS. It makes us look courageous, but please do your assignment. Develop your military capabilities, show that we really have continuous and effective exercise of sovereignty. That is the assignment that the Philippines should really do in the coming years.
It will depend on the appropriations from the Committee on Appropriations at the House and the Senate. Yes, Jerry?
Conflict is always a mess. And the more variables you introduce into it, the more problems that you create. Let's backtrack. Let me go back to US President George Bush, just a little. When they went to Iraq, it's more on oil. It's economy. Here, the conflict started with economy, with improving economy in China, like what Chito and the professor has been telling. It's more of how to maintain their economic growth. Now,
and how to contain China, ganon.
And now, let me ask you this. Is this the real reason before it's purely economic? Why are we buying these armaments when we could deal with China economically and improve both ways, that kind of thing? And Senator Shihani mentioned about what is your interest. It should be also economic in nature.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. By the way, we also invited Mr. Shang Hua of the Chinese Embassy. He would have wanted to join us, but last minute he opted not to join us and would rather want to listen and watch what the media will show a bit later. So, Elmer, you have a question, or Mark from GMA? No more questions? All right. Let me ask the gentleman, what do you foresee from now until 2016? Will the Chinese just wait for a new administration by June 30 of 2016?
To view this issue, what would help is you actually view it on three levels. One is the political aspect, the sovereign and legal, the sovereignty issue. Who really owns Spratlys? Who really owns the Scarborough? And what are the maritime entitlements that you can derive from it? So that's the political legal that we've been talking about. The second one is the economic, the resources, the fish, the oil, and all of that, which actually I think is what's driving the issue right now. But the bigger picture is the strategic. So the political legal, the economic, and the strategic. The strategic issue really has to do with who will be the big power that will dominate Asia, that will dominate or control the strategic sea lanes of South China Sea and East China Sea. And I maintain, right now, we are in the stage of Pax Americana. It is the U.S. that guarantees this freedom of navigation, that guarantees the trade routes, and that guarantees, in a sense, peace and stability. What is happening is that the Chinese are now starting to challenge American dominance. They can't do it yet. They cannot replace the Americans, and the Americans will not give up so easily. So you will find this transition stage of intensifying geopolitical and strategic rivalry. Will there come a time that, that it will be a pax sinica, that the Chinese will be the dominant power? This may be part of the Chinese dream, but they are far away from it. What may happen as a next stage is to watch carefully the staying power of the U.S. Because of what's happening in the U.S. in terms of their budget deficits, in terms of what's happening in terms of their capability, military and economic capability, how long can the U.S. maintain its dominance? And can the Chinese achieve their economic goals? Those are two factors to watch out. But now you have a different situation. You actually have other powers to consider. Japan is a power. India is a rising power. The same with Indonesia, Australia. So you could have a concert of powers. What is happening right now really is the formation of two coalitions. One, you have the US, Japan, the Philippines, Australia. It is like a balancing coalition to balance the rise of Chinese power. And you have China, North Korea, you have Cambodia, Laos, and you could add in Myanmar as the other coalition. But does this mean that war is inevitable between a dominant power and a rising power? If you look at the writings of some of the scholars in international politics, some of them say it is inevitable. But it is not necessarily inevitable because it depends on the strategic choices on both sides. And you can see that the US and China are trying to avoid a direct conflict. However, what is not clear is the Chinese, of course, want their near seas, and their definition of their near seas is East China Sea and South China Sea, and the US will not agree to that. So this will define, I think, the next few decades on who will be the dominant power in the East China Sea and South China Sea. As for 2016, let's see how long this arbitration will run. Hopefully, we could have a ruling by next year, if not by 2016. I think the Chinese basically are prepared to wait. And the Chinese think in strategic terms. You know, 2 years, we can wait for 2 years, and then let's see what the new administration will be. The Chinese hope, of course, is that there will be a government that will be willing to engage in negotiations with the Chinese. The question actually is for the Philippine side and whoever will be in the new administration. Where lies our national interest and whether we should learn from the Vietnamese case, from the Malaysian tactic, and see whether there is a way to combine multilateral and bilateral. Because I think we have now tried sort of the spectrum from a close relations with China under GMA to now almost a confrontational approach under the current administration. And probably at some point, the pendulum will settle in the middle, and hopefully we will find a happy mean. And our goal should be to keep what we hold on to right now. That should be the goal. And if we use the right tactics, that should be the test, if we can hold on to what we have. In the case of Scarborough, I think the situation has shown that in our attempt to assert, we actually lost effective control. Would it have been more effective if we just issued a diplomatic protest then? Or the key is the opening move. If your opening move is a tactical miscalculation, or if you don't anticipate the Chinese pushback and their determination to defend what they think is theirs, then you will be caught in a bind. So there are enough lessons, I think, for the Philippines to learn from, and hopefully we can apply this for the next 2 years or so.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Yes, please.
Yeah. To put it very simply, I always say that when you look at the disputes in the Western Pacific, it's a three-dimensional chess game. The Chinese play the Go chess game, we play the Western chess game. And that's why there's a monocausal, a single variable understanding of this dispute. I think it's quite too simplistic. But nevertheless, I think there's a strong energy security dimension to this. For the Chinese, first of all, there's a defensive notion of energy security. The Chinese get 2/3 of their oil all the way from the Middle East, right? And if you look at how the oil transforms, it goes through the Persian Gulf. Most are US allies there with the exception of Iran. It goes all the way through India, which is a strategic partner of US. Then it goes to the Strait of Malacca, and then Malaysia and Singapore are strong friends of US. And then it goes all the way to the South China Sea. Again, you have Philippines and Taiwan there. From the perspective of the Chinese, of course, they have to prepare for a worst-case scenario. For them, what if one day the Americans and the Japanese will say that we had enough of China's growth, and in one way we want to choke them and make it very difficult for them. So they feel vulnerable. For them, it's a defensive energy security move to make sure that they also have strong position along all of those sea lanes of communication. That is why the Chinese have been pushing for the Gaudar port in Pakistan. They have been pushing for more naval agreements with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. They are developing actually bases in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, etc. So this is a defensive move on the part of the Chinese to make sure that sea lanes of communications are not vulnerable to being choked by their adversary one day down the road. But there's an offensive dimension also that makes me a little bit worried. If you look at the latest study by the American Energy Information Agency, it says that the bulk of prospective hydrocarbon reserves, which will make the South China Sea the second Persian Gulf in terms of gas and oil, is actually in the Reed Bank area. No? And that is where things a little bit get fuzzy, because the Chinese in the last 10 to 15 years have been developing their offshore drilling capabilities. If you look at China, it doesn't have that much of offshore drilling resources, let's say like the countries in the Persian Gulf. So for many, they're asking, why would China develop such an advanced offshore drilling capability if it doesn't have its sight on something pricey in the area? So that is why that's where the conspiracy theory comes in, that perhaps the Chinese are putting their eyes really on the hydrocarbon reserves in the South China Sea. And that is why they're also very much concerned about the developments that are happening in the Reed Bank area. So I think this energy security dimension has two defensive and offensive dimensions that we should not forget. The other thing that I want to say is that I think the Chinese learned something very important with the rise of the Aquino administration. They realized that when you deal with democracies, election cycles are extremely important. I mean, if you talk to a lot of Chinese, and I've written a lot of pieces on Philippine-China relationship during the Arroyo time, those were the golden era. You know, a tremendous amount of economic exchanges, even on the defense level. And for the Chinese, they thought, this is it. We arrived at it. Even a former American protectorate is now within our sphere of influence. And then a new administration comes in. Aquino makes it very clear. We are against all the corruption of the previous administration, including countries that have been in one way or another tied to that corruption. And China was automatically part of it. And then we had a joint maritime seismic undertaking. Vietnamese were part of that. The Chinese were part of that. We threw out the baby with the bathwater. I think the JMSU was essentially a good idea, but it was conducted in the wrong way by a corrupt administration. It could have been conducted in a more transparent and consultative way under a much more legitimate administration under Aquino. But what happened under Aquino is that we threw everything that GMA achieved as far as bilateral relations with China were concerned. And Chinese rising territorial assertiveness in 2009 and 10 didn't help the case at all. But the Chinese are saying, look at the surveys right now. Who will most likely be the next president of the Philippines? And someone they look at is the current vice president. And I think the impression of the current vice president is that he is much more pragmatic, and he will try to find a way to make sure that our $30 billion of economic ties, our strategic relations with China will not be compromised. So I think the Chinese are saying, wait 2 years, up to 2015, Aquino will be a lame duck. All of these crises and tensions that we're observing, maybe it's a reflection of Aquino and more likely also Secretary Del Rosario. If you look at it, one of the major problems we had in terms of dealing with the Chinese is that they had issues with our foreign secretary. They felt that our foreign secretary is too close to the Americans, our foreign secretary is too appreciative of the Americans. That is why, remember in 2012, we sent a senator, Senator Trillanes, to negotiate with the Chinese to de-escalate situation in Scarborough Shoal. Well, that didn't go well, right? But moving on, my point is that one problem we have is that we do not have an interlocutor which is acceptable to both sides. Okay. And I think that's an important thing we should do 2 to 3 years down the road. DFA and the Aquino administration should find someone, I'm sure there is someone down there, which the Chinese will accept as neutral and credible enough, and that person will make sure that there will not be any accidental conflict down the road. More than establishing who should have sovereignty over those territorial disputes, more than establishing whether the 9-line doctrine of China, which is very infamous, has any basis in international law, I think one thing that everyone forgets is this. In the 1960s and 70s, at the height of Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States had a series of agreements of incidents in the high seas. They wanted to make sure that if there was an accident between Russian submarines and American ships, this would not escalate into a nuclear war or full-scale war. The problem right now is that there is no such agreement, as far as I'm concerned, between the Philippines and China. A small accident in the South China Sea at any moment, no matter how inadvertent, could be played up by media in China and media in the Philippines, and that could escalate into a full-scale war. So what we need most of all to establish is a credible mechanism to make sure that any unwanted incidents or accidents in the South China Sea will not be exploited by one party to justify an aggressive move. If we look at a few months back, remember there was this tit-tat between the Philippines saying, oh, our fishermen were cannoned water, the Chinese saying, oh, no. And at the end of the day, we didn't really have a credible way of establishing what on earth happened. Now, imagine a situation, a Filipino boat runs into a Chinese Coast Guard, and there's a shooting. And then you don't know what the hell happened. Whose fault was that? You can expect Philippine media completely blaming the Chinese. You can expect the Chinese going all the way and saying the Filipinos have opened the war. So I think what's important right now is to also focus on making sure that we have credible mechanisms of conflict prevention and de-escalation.
You mentioned the name of Binay. So does that mean that Binay's candidacy for the presidency has already been sealed? Because the Americans will not favor that.
I think that's too sensitive a question. We have friends here who perhaps can elaborate on that. But
Well, anyway, yes, Chito, would you care to say anything about it? The Binay magic?
I think the Vice President has had direct experience in negotiating with the Chinese on the case of the drug mules. Partly successful, but also in the end, they were executed. So it didn't work. So I think he has an idea of how to deal with the Chinese. But the president also, the vice president also, I think he's due to give a talk in Washington. I think it's probably happening now or next week at the Center for Strategic Studies in Washington. So I think the vice president wisely is trying to know and to develop contacts with the different powers that has interest in the Philippines, both China, U.S., Japan. I wouldn't say that he's entirely pro-China. I don't think that is the case. I think he also spent time at the Kennedy School. He was trying to study, international politics at the Kennedy School a few years back. So I think the different candidates will ultimately have to face the question of how to pursue, the Philippine interests and how to do it in a way that will defend our interests in an effective way. And ultimately, hopefully by then, we will know the results of the tribunal so that we could proceed to the next stage. Because until then, you basically have to wait for the results of the tribunal, while at the same time trying to manage the issue and maintaining political and diplomatic relations with China. And hopefully we can maintain our trade, tourism with China. Now virtually there's no aid program from China, no loans from China, very little investment. I mean, this is part already of the frozen political and economic relations. What we have are still trade, mutually beneficial trade, and tourism. And hopefully we can maintain this as we go through this arbitration process.
With that, we bring to a close one of the most intelligent sessions we ever had sa Tapatan sa Aristocrat. It's a pleasure to have intelligent people and intelligent media men with us today. However, let me warn you, gentlemen, you will also be ambushed by our friends from the media right after this. So for the traditional firing squad photo, maraming salamat po. We'd like to acknowledge our friends from the U.S. Embassy and the Vietnamese Embassy who took time out to be with us today. Thank you.